Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Greenlight Bookstore on Fulton Street. I'm Joyce, the Events and Marketing Manager here at Greenlight, and we are so excited tonight to be hosting the event with Samantha Hunt, presenting her new book, The Unwritten Book, an Investigation. Before I turn things over to her, just a couple of housekeeping reminders. We do ask that everyone keeps their masks on for the entirety of your time in the store this evening, and please silence any electronic devices. We are recording this event tonight. Say hi to the camera, so if all turns out well, we'll share it on our YouTube channel and other social media platforms later on. And most importantly, don't forget to buy the book. If you purchased a book bundle with your ticket, thank you so much. Hopefully you picked that up at the door. If not, we'll get it to you before the end of the night. Samantha will be signing copies after her reading and talk tonight, so you can be able to get it signed right here. And we have her whole backstock list available for purchase as well. Your purchase of the Unwritten Book and all others makes it possible for Greenlight to continue to offer accessible event programming like this, and so thank you for helping to make this independent bookstore sustainable. Now on to the good stuff. Our featured author this evening is Samantha Hunt. Samantha is the author of the story collection The Dark Dark and the novels Mr. Splitfoot, The Invention of Everything Else, and The Seas. Hunt is the recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship, the Bard Fiction Prize, the National Book Foundation's 5 Under 35 Prize, and the St. Francis College Literary Prize, and she was a finalist for the Orange Prize and the Penn Faulkner Award. She lives in upstate New York. Her new book, The Unwritten Book, is a genre-bending work of nonfiction that explores ghosts, ghost stories, and haunting in the broadest sense of each. What is it to be haunted, to be a ghost, to die, to live, to read? Books are ghosts, reading is communion with the dead. Maggie Nelson praised it as a beautiful, inventive collection shot through with wildness and grace. So you're in for something really special tonight. Samantha will be reading from the book, and you'll have a chance to ask questions after that. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Samantha Hunt.
Frighten anybody with my breath. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Greenlight, for having me so much. They wrote on the invitation, interviewer to be announced, and I was like, ooh, I know that that's the way that these things are done now, but I'm not really good at that, the interviewing, and so I was like, well, that's kind of perfect, you know, like, Elijah the Prophet is my interviewer tonight, and the book is a lot about invisibles, so I thought that was appropriate somehow. One structure that really informed it, and a lot of my thinking, a lot of my writing, is the structure of the Rings of Saturn, thinking about the Rings of Saturn like individual ice crystals being held together in orbit, and just things we can't see holding things together. And the thing that I like about that is like it kind of is our structure as we sit here tonight together with each other. It's also the way that I write very much. I'm like, oh, a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit there. And just to confuse you, it's kind of going to be how I read tonight too. I'm going to do a little bit from here, a little bit from here, a little bit from here. This is so strange with you guys all masked because it's a slow dawning of me recognizing you. And I'm like, and so if I seem distracted, it's because I'm like looking at your eyes going, oh, that is a friend of mine. It takes me a bit. All right, so here's a little bit about the Rings of Saturn, just to start us off. The Rings of Saturn are far away. 1.2 billion kilometers at their closest. Still their structure, tiny individual crystals held loosely together in a circular orbit, feels deeply familiar and intimate. Dots and leaps, holes and collisions, bleeding, mingling, messy birth, bumbling, multiverse, stumbling. The Rings of Saturn are like the scattered, dusty house I live in, my body. They feel true to the way that I've shelved Carl Sagan's Cosmos between my Grandma Marcella's diary of 1983, October 20th, permanent wave, 2:30, and a copy of the Reader's Digest that features a disaster narrative my dad edited, Adrift in the South Pacific. Once I wrote a love letter to an artist who builds tremendous spheres. In the letter, I told him everything that I thought about Saturn's rings, how distant between our particles of dust and ice might not signify alienation, but rather a kinder plan that allows space for current and mystery to exist between points, between people, between ideas. The nature of longing and tolerance. He never wrote back. I suppose there's a certain mystery to that, and a perfect model for unrequited desire. But afterwards, when considering his chilly attitude toward our sixth planet, it was easy to not be in love with him anymore. The desire for bodies is rooted in our mortality. The desire for books shares a similar fevered passion with our decomposition. We will never be able to read all the books or love all the bodies. We feel the comfort of our smallness, our minerals, our parts. As with the dust of Saturn's rings, our eyeballs also reside in orbits. Rods and cones perceive partial information. Our brains concoct the rest to create vision. Sight contains so much imagination, one wonders if the view of a mountain is fiction or nonfiction. Thoughts take leaps, chemistry to minerals, to nature, to biology, to living, to dying, to reading, to paper, to trees, back to chemistry. Or maybe less logical. Maybe chemistry leads to thoughts of nail polish, yeasted breads, high school, or quilts. Either way, collected ideas bounce off one another like some percussive instrument, and the sound of one thought striking another thought is a beautiful sound. All this to ask, where should I begin when writing a book about birds, words, books, death, hormones, collections, desire, letters, booze, family, birds? A circle starts where? Or more to the point, a circle ends where? I have lost my mind to books. That is also true. I sometimes study a book to the point of obsession. I paw at it until I've worn through the very fabric of sanity. Sometimes it's fun, like being addicted to crosswords. The universe is filled with clues, even if it's not. What I mean is, there's an owl outside my house at 3 a.m. talking to another owl. I imagine the nature of their conversation. I bet I'm wrong. I haven't yet learned the language of the birds. That's okay. Delusion can be close to revelation. Birding delights me. Believing delights me. It's a game. It's artifice. It's art. Barry Holston Lopez writes of the great blue heron, "If you will not speak, I will have to consider making you up." My mom lost her wedding ring. She does that regularly, as her house is complicated by an abundance of stuff. She's an artist. Some people might use an ugly word to describe my mother's house, but it's a bad word. She hates the word, and I won't use it here. Imagine instead the hole that swallowed that word. My mom says, I know I shouldn't be so attached to objects. Then, can you look in your house? Maybe I left my ring at your house. I have my own problematic attachment to objects, especially books. She asks my dad to help her find the ring also. He's been dead for decades. But after she asks him, she finds the ring in a coin purse under a bag of hangers in her hall. I have no idea how it got there, she says. One daughter asks me, where's your dad? He's a cardinal now. It's a story that my siblings and I came up with after he died, something to make death bearable and visible. Like a bird, she asks. Yes. And then sometimes we have 4 or 5 cardinals in our yard at the same time. It's not a magical deduction. It's not supernatural. It's reading. Maybe I shouldn't be so attached to objects either, but everyone keeps dying, leaving stuff behind, objects I can't usually get rid of. And I enjoy the company of the dead. They are so quiet. They know things I don't know. The dead leave clues, and life is a puzzle of trying to read and understand these mysterious hints before the game is over, even if these clues are not coming from the dead, even if I'm making the whole thing up. That was from, I should have told you that before, that's from the first essay called Circulation Desk. That's about libraries, but it's also about circulatory systems and just round things like the rings of Saturn, like our eyeballs. Lots of round things in there. The next one, I'm actually going to read you the whole one, and I won't jerk you around in the cruel way that maybe felt. I hope that didn't feel cruel. But this is a shorter essay, and it's the whole piece that's called, or almost the whole piece, called Devour. I grew up in a house built in 1765, old for America. My family has lived in the same house for more than 50 years, which has given me time to consider the other humans who haunted these rooms. Daughters of 1803, brothers of 1920, teenagers of 1792. I wasn't alive when my family moved in, but I like to imagine that first day, when the rooms were bare, empty, quiet, when the house was like this. Packed with emptiness. It's not like that anymore. In the 60s, my mother and father came to the house after tough times, bad first marriages, custody battles, lost loved ones. They wanted a new start. My mom was pregnant. When they moved in, she spoke frankly to the ghosts, even though she doesn't really believe in the ghosts, except for when she does. You're welcome to stay, but please never show yourself. Perhaps my mother's sense of hospitality or curiosity prevented her from asking the ghosts to simply leave. So far, a deal is a deal. None of us have ever seen a ghost in our old house. Students from the elementary school used to visit our house to learn about colonial dwellings. Once my mom set the date with the school teachers, then forgot. My parents went traveling and left us home with an auntie who was surprised when a busload of elementary school children arrived expecting a tour. She showed them the brick oven built into our enormous chimney. She showed them our outhouse and chicken coop. Then, not wanting accuracy to stand in the way of effective storytelling, she showed the children the back secret staircase built as a fire escape. This, children, is where they hid from the redcoats. A statement that, while perhaps untrue, speaks to the fearful history of my small town, the site of both a Revolutionary War battle and earlier, during Keith's War, a massacre of 500 to 700 Wappinger people over the course of one night in 1644. For many years, I had imagined that because my town is small, it might somehow have escaped violence and fear, as if in being little, it might hide from what is huge and horrible. Another story I created. Our outhouse is a double-seater. When I consider the number of people who may have lived in my house before me, I multiply the number by 2, like the toilet seats. I have no idea how many people this house and land have held. A lot. Our narrow dining room and all the Decembers that have happened inside it are like glass slides, held up to the light, singularly or layered. The others who sat here before me, warm from wine, what part of this dust is theirs? The house has beams cut from American chestnut, a species that, more or less, no longer exists. These beams tempt me to think of our house as a living tree. Before furnaces, families hung blankets from the beams in winter to close off rooms and trap the fireplace's heat in a smaller space. The family would gather in these blanket rooms. The Historical Society wants to include my parents' house in their register, but my mom likes her freedom. She says they can have it when she moves out. I don't think she's ever going to move out of that house. My mother is a beauty, a serious practical joker, an opera fan, a painter, a lover of literature, flowers, carnivals, dessert, travel, children, and people. She is kind, funny, and intelligent. She is a sharp dresser. When I plug a description of her house into the National Study on Chronic Organizations Clutter Scale, it ranks between a level 3 and a level 4. There are 5 levels. The blindness of categories is a tool to flatten the story. Olympia Dukakis delivers the best line in Norman Jewison's 1987 film Moonstruck. To her cheating husband, she says, "Cosmo, I just want you to know, no matter what you do, you're gonna die like everybody else. If my mom keeps all her stuff, maybe she'll keep on living. Seems worth a shot." She doesn't buy new things. The stuff in her house is old. A copy of Treasure Island inscribed to my father, to Walter Jr. from Duell and Phelps, Christmas 1940. My mother's well-played with Ziegfeld Girl paper dolls from 1941, Patricia Dane, Louise Laplanche, Anna Taranda, and even the inventor Hedy Lamarr. Their undergarments, printed with stars that seem distant, as if they're seeing their light across the universe, and they've already burnt out. I find a xylophone made to look like a green caterpillar, a miniature stuffed pink hot air balloon whose basket hides a music box, an empty tin of lotus tea, a souvenir from my wedding, a tin of pickup sticks, and a cookie box printed to resemble needlepoint. Saturday's child is full of grace. It's stuffed with crayons. I was born on a Saturday. There's beauty in her house and lots to look at, thrift store clothes and art books. There's little of financial value, but much that's rich in color and meaning. If I started reading the books in my parents' house right now, I'd die still reading. In between my visits, some things disappear and others emerge. I suspect things in the house are reproducing. The child of a Dutch windmill salt shaker and the old brown velvet couch might be the elegant secretary with an angled tabletop that one day appeared in the kitchen. My mom doesn't buy things, but things I've never seen before sometimes suddenly appear. I tell her, "You can't hold on to every beautiful thing." But watching her sort through a pile of old magazines is like watching an Arctic hunter carving up a seal. There's no part of the beast without a purpose. Nothing goes to waste under my mother's attentions. She finds value in things that others might discard. An article about South American frescoes that was written in 1992 holds just as much value to her today as it was when it was first published. Perhaps even more now, since a periodical from 1992 might be hard to find. I admire her thriftiness, even if sometimes I worry that what she's done is built herself a very colorful tomb. Every now and then, important things do get lost in the ramble of her home. We had my dad cremated. You can see where this is going. My mom put his ashes in an old cookie tin. Then she put the tin into his well-loved briefcase. Then she put the whole thing under the bed they'd shared for 30-odd years. After some time, my mom started to date other people. Maybe it became strange to have the ashes of her dead husband underneath her bed when she had a boyfriend. She moved my dad into another room. A few years later, one of my daughters asked, "Where's your dad?" He smoked cigarettes, so he died. So what happened to his body? We burned him. I've been honest with my daughters from the start. I tell them what I can about sex, death, birth, all of it. It seems easier to slip in these truths from the beginning when everything is equally surprising/unsurprising. Carrots, sandwiches, cancer, hand jobs, menstruation, tulips, decay. My daughter wanted to see what my dad's ashes looked like. I asked my mom, "Where's Dad?" We looked. My dad was lost. She knew he was in the house. She just couldn't at that moment say where. There's a peace that comes over me in this house, something similar to floating in a warm ocean. Maybe it's a desire to drown. It is impossible not to find beauty there. Interesting ideas everywhere I look, the detritus of humans who make art. The house also winnows out from my life anyone who is uptight. The house reminds me that order is temporary and that it is better to learn to feel at home in spaces that lack order, rooms that don't make a human sense. The peace I find in this house is that of being lost with no desire to ever be found. It is surrender and the realization that I am also part of the house and my mom's collections. I left New York City soon after my landlords replaced the wooden front doors, doors that had stood since the turn of the last century, with plastic ones. Now, only a decade later, those new doors have already peeled and paled. They are self-destructing. The lies capitalism tells in order to sell more things. I was out of my apartment barely a week when, passing back by, I found our 7-foot-long pink cast iron tub. It had been left at the curb as rubbish. It had cleaned bodies since the 1940s. It was one of the best things in the apartment. Nieces and nephews would come visit just to bathe in our pink tub. I tried to take it with me, but I couldn't even lift one corner of that old tub, made as it had been to last forever. I wonder where that tub is now. As a family of 8, camping was how we spent our vacations. It was cheap enough. Our tent was a heavy green canvas number, so difficult to erect that it often took half the family to set it up. I remember one victorious camping trip. My mom and her sister, both married to alcoholics, were fed up, so they packed me and my cousin Christine into a station wagon and we left. We didn't arrive at our campsite until after dark. The moms went to battle with that tent. In the past, they'd always relied on the men. That night turned out to be no different. After cursing so loudly for so long, they stirred the campground neighbors to sympathy. 2 brothers arrived with a hammer and had the tent set up shortly thereafter. Recently, I found that old green tent in my basement. It hadn't been set up in over 20 years, but none of us have the stomach to junk it. How long and well it held us all together. It leaked in the rain. My mother would wake and construct beach towel dikes to divert the flood. Such tenderness in that tent, a place I remember as being kind, sturdy, exhausted. I set the tent up with my daughters thinking it would make a summer fort. And it did, for a day. But now the tent's been up for weeks and I'm the only one playing in it. The daily thunderstorms that rip through here knock it down, soak its insides every afternoon, so I set it up again in order to dry it out before I put it away. Or I set it up again because each time I step inside, the musty, earthy odor zooms me into the past, a terrifically fast time machine. I mentioned the scent to my sister Amy over the phone. It's such a deeply lodged sense memory that even 6 hours away, she could smell that old tent too. I'm happy to make meaning out of any old thing I find. Here's the past in my backyard. The past is hard to keep standing up. The past is also hard to take down. The tent weighs more than I do. I note that the past has completely killed the summer grass that had been growing beneath it. I hoist the bagged up old tent onto my shoulder. I carry it across my back. It's easy to imagine that the tent is my father's dead body. It's the right shape, the right weight. He loved this tent. I lug, I hug, and sometimes I even ask myself, why am I carrying around this heavy dead thing that kills the grass? After my dad was gone, I took books from his library thinking I could build a small replica of him inside of me by reading what he had read. My father had been so smart. He'd been so full of book learning. Having him with me was like having a walking work of reference before the internet. I could ask him anything, and chances were good that he knew something. Not necessarily on every topic, but near every topic. If my interests were Irish holy wells, he might tell me something about Appalachian Springs. A tangent that might become a new path, like browsing the stacks in a library and not finding the book you're looking for, but finding the book you weren't looking for. One of the books I took from my dad was Joseph Twaddle Shipley's The Dictionary of Word Origins. I'm not sure what this book meant to my father, or even how often he referred to it in his life, But after he was gone, I asked the dictionary the things I could no longer ask him. Word origins became a place for talking with the dead, a tool of divination. It's never far from my hand. One of the best parts about Shipley's dictionary is that in an effort to be efficient, he points out the relationships between words. He builds beautiful and astonishing connections. On a day when I miss my dad, I might look up the word die, searching for a hint or a way to better understand sorrow. And Shipley, because his dictionary is capacious, responds with, die, see sequin. The whole death maid isn't filled, but it flashes with glitter. Romantic trouble, I ask? And Shipley, sounding much like my dad, says, boy, see a lass. When my body was battered by doctors, Shipley told me, gynecology, see banshee. His work is poetry. It illuminates and broadens my understanding as verse does. It makes me feel part of all. It makes gentle sense, spreading joy and curiosity. It suggests that wisdom is not hierarchical. There's no ladder going up, but cyclical, relational. Sometimes I have no question, but open Shipley to any old page, throw in the bones. Phantom, see focus. Fashion, see defeat. Rape, see alcohol. Sometimes I don't even follow up with Shipley's reference word, enjoying and imagining the electric distance between phantom and focus. Other times I keep reading and I'm further rewarded. Devour, see sarcophagus. Sarcophagus. The ancient Greeks buried bodies in coffins or pits made of a kind of limestone, which supposedly consumed them. They called this coffin a sarcophagus, from Greek sarx, flesh, and phagon, to eat. The full definition goes on to include references to geophagy, omnibus, carnal, coronation, carnival, sarcasm, morsel, mausoleum, among others. Shipley's act of reference, XCY, teaches me that everything is connected, everyone is related. XCY, YCO, OC3, 3C tree. In Shipley we are linked. We are part of the whole. Merlin Sheldrake, the author of Entangled Life, How Fungi Make Our World, Change Our Minds, and Shape Our Futures, writes, the authors of a seminal paper on the symbiotic view of life take a clear stance on this point. There have never been individuals, they declare. We are all lichens. And lichens, Sheldrake tells us, flicker between wholes and collections of parts. Lichens are stabilized networks of relationships. They never stop lichenizing. They are verbs as well as nouns. What book do you use as oracle? What book don't you use that way? What book is not a work of reference pointing in the direction of every book our author has read, job her parents have worked, meal she's eaten, film she's seen, road she's walked, rock she's kicked, microbe she's never even imagined? My dad had been sick for about a year with lung and colon cancer when he collapsed upstairs. I was at work, but my brother Charlie took care of him. From the floor, my dad said, maybe if he had something to eat, he'd regain his strength. Charlie brought him a chocolate donut with rainbow sprinkles, the sort of confection my father loved. My dad ate half of the donut before admitting that something more serious was wrong with his body. Charlie and my mom took him to the hospital. We created a lot of stories when our dad was sick, things to believe in, like hospitals stop death, or maybe you just need something sweet to eat and then you'll feel better. Once, my dad sent me to the store for some Preparation H, and we shared a moment of believing that the tumors in his colon might actually just be hemorrhoids, a fiction that felt temporarily courageous as hope. When my dad was still in our home, we felt we were still in charge of the narrative. We are good with fictions. Our house is made for fictions. They seem to crop up there like mushrooms. When my dad was admitted to the hospital, the story changed. Our beliefs, however fungal, were scrubbed clean. Other people got involved, people who side with nonfiction. One doctor, perhaps noticing my skill in self-delusion, told me, "He's gonna die. You know he's gonna die, right?" I asked her to leave. Denying death is foolish, I know, but there's still a part of me, a very immature part of me, that believes my dad would still be alive if I'd kept him better wrapped up in stories. The morning after he died, I lay down in the place where he'd collapsed at home. It had been a week since he'd fallen there. From this position, I had a good view underneath the cabinet. There, among the dust bunnies, I found the other half of the chocolate donut. I swallowed the half donut quickly before I could think. I suspected that if I didn't eat it right away, I'd be stuck with this donut for the rest of my life, making a monument out of a half-eaten piece of cake. Yes, I shouldn't be so attached to objects. I went on to eat the hairs that remained in my dad's humble hairbrush, remembering some distorted childhood wisdom that says hair lasts 7 years in the stomach. It was an experiment. I enjoy conducting experiments. I thought if I could keep him with me for 7 years, maybe by then death would hurt me less. That turned out to be very true. 7 years later, his death hurt far less. But that day with the donut, I was still unhinged by my dad's dying. He was 71, not too young, but it seemed there was much more that he should have seen in life. His death seemed an impossible thing, like someone vanishing into thin air right in front of my eyes. I was distraught by the loss of stories he hadn't yet told me. Like Shipley's, the poet Heather McHugh's knowledge of etymologies runs deep. Sometimes her sentences overwhelm with doubled and tripled meanings, some of them even unintended. Her lectures are built like New Orleans graveyards, coffins, and meanings are stacked 3 or 4 high. McHugh once told me, "Language's orders are of means, grammar, and syntax. Its disorders are of meaning, like finding eros in the word erosive." That's an important one for me, student of geology, the place where desire and rocks meet. McHugh went on to tell me etymology is etiology. I had to look up the word etiology. It's a term most often used in medicine, meaning the cause of a disease or abnormal condition. So words as illness. Soon after I ate the donut, I went searching through the house for more of my dad. What else could I eat? He'd lived in that house for more than 30 years. He was everywhere except that he was gone. I found his black wing pencils in each room, crosswords, finished and unfinished. I started collecting everything like a detective, bagging up evidence I'd use to make a new narrative. In one desk drawer, I found a handful of typed pages. My dad wrote a novel in the 80s called The Land of Counterpain. I asked if I could read the manuscript when I was in high school. The book is about a silent movie star coming into the age of talkies. Much of his book went over my head at the time that I read it, but I liked having something to talk about with him. I wanted to know him well, and that wasn't always easy. He had a lot of children, and he was quiet, modest man who didn't readily share the stories of his life unless you could get him alone. My dad was never able to get The Land of Counterpain published, and after years of his and his agent trying and failing to find a publisher, he stopped talking about his writing. Maybe he'd even stopped writing. In the rush of ambition that I felt in my youth, I rarely moved slowly enough to ask him about his own work. Though I was with him on the day he died, I left at midday. I had a reading that night at the Bowery Ballroom. As I left, I told my dad not to die. At dress rehearsal, a phone call told me that he was gone. For a strange half hour, I sat in the theater imagining that I would still perform that night, some high school sense of the show must go on, as if the show were important. But then a rush of blood filled my ears, loud as a flood. Whose blood? I couldn't hear anything but the rush. It can be horrible to be a self, an ego. I didn't want the flood, the blood of those who'd come before me, to go away without me. I want to be part of that blood, that flood. Such a rush of sound. I couldn't hear the words the people in the theater were saying, so I left. I went to go find what remained of my family. I sometimes regret the ambition of my youth and wish I'd spent more time moving slowly, or I wish for more than one life. I wish to try life more than one way. The pages I found in the desk drawer a couple of weeks after his death were not from the land of counterpain. These were something else, from a book I hadn't read before. I clung to those pages. I had so many unanswered questions for my father, some really basic ones like, what hospital were you born in? Where is the money that you left for Mom? What happened when you were drafted? Who were your childhood friends? How did you make that pot roast with the onion soup mix? Some questions were less basic. Where are you? What are you thinking? Do you miss us as much as we miss you? Even more than the books in his library, the pages in my hand were something I could work with. With these pages, I thought, I'll talk with the dead. And I knew, even at the start, that the answers to my questions might not be simply presented. They might not be clear. Clarity is a lot to ask from someone who can no longer breathe. But I could read my dad's writing. I could make interpretations and solve mysteries. I could build references. Even when the rocks are busted up into tiny bits or transformed by heat and erosion, geologists can still gather information. These pages felt like that. My dad had changed, but he'd left behind clues, building materials. I didn't eat my father's book. I devoured it. I think that's all I'm going to read you tonight. So the unwritten book of the title is there. My dad's book is in here, at least those three chapters. And I kind of was like, I don't know whether to include it or not. Especially, my husband was like, that's boring. Don't put it in there. It's not boring. I swear to God, I don't think it's boring at all. It's funny. I read somebody who was writing online, and they were like, that's the best part of the book. And I was like, so true. But so it's in here, and what I did, so it's like this part is my dad's book, and then this is I annotate it, most annoyingly, like a little buzzing fly interrupting your reading. I'm like, but the real truth is, I'm like the annoying daughter interrupting it in here. And the way that I thought to do this was like, I have two of my daughters are twins, and it definitely came out of the fact of tandem breastfeeding. I'll give you a visual here. And I would be doing that, and I'd put a book in between their heads, and I'd be reading. And I was really annoyed that everything else in my body could move separately, even my boobs. I was two separate purposes. And my eyes, I was I can't read two books at the same time. And it was so annoying to me. I was because that's how greedy I am to read books. I was what if I could two babies, two books, and just reading those books. But I couldn't. So maybe you can, and you can do that at the same time. If not, I'm gonna have to be the little annoying voice poking in there to interrupt you. The other thing, was that me? I did that. Ooh, that was fun. I'm sorry. That was my dad. Right? No. I kind of don't really believe in ghosts. I kind of do. I kind of don't. I kind of do. I kind of don't. Like Mr. Splitfoot, right? Those of you guys who read that one. That's what that whole book is about. I'm let me argue for ghosts. And then I'm in the other half of the book, let me argue against them. That's fun. Wait, what was I going to tell you? Oh, I know what I was going to tell you. Just one more thing about the book, and then I'm happy to answer any questions too. Is I just took a group of students. I teach at Pratt, right up here. And I just took a group of students to the New York Public Library, and there's that exhibit there right now, Treasures of the Library, which maybe some folks have seen. It's really great. And they have a collection of miniature books there, like somebody's little miniature library. And I've always been fascinated by miniatures. There's a whole part of the book that's about that fascination with miniatures, and also just rethinking what smallness means. I mean, especially for us right now, I think that we've all been, you're all sitting here in masks because of something really small. Small things change our life all the time, and so I love that idea of the small is the mightiest thing, the most powerful thing. Sorry, back to those little tiny books in the library. there's that Rings of Saturn structure. I realized that, like, I love that idea of having your own little tiny personal library that you could carry around, and I was like, oh, that's what I was trying to build here. So inside this book is like every writer and artist, not everyone, because then it would have to be like a much bigger book, but who is in there, like all the people, like lots and lots and lots of people who influenced me over my life. And I kind of was like joking with myself that I was just going to read the bibliography to people when I was giving the reading, because there's a pretty long bibliography. It's called The Forest at the end, but then I thought people might be mad at me if I just sat here and read a bunch of names. Also, that's kind of name droppy, isn't it? Because I'm like, yeah, Borges. He's my friend. He's in my bibliography. But in some ways, it is just a little mini library for me. And thinking about ways that we can commune, ways that we can use these objects in our life as a place to find greater meaning, as we do in books. Hopefully that made a little bit of sense. But even if it didn't, ask me questions and demand sense from me. No. Does anybody have a question? As the reading starts to end, now I'm starting to see some, I'm like, okay, I'm starting to recognize. Anybody have a question? Yeah.
Hi.
Hey.
I have found this kind of theme running through so much of your work of silences and like people losing their voices. So like your great-grandmother here and Sebald, and then in Splitfoot, Ruth and Linda Thompson. And I thought it was silences, and I'm realizing it might be an obsession with the inability to communicate. And I'm wondering, like, what you do when you can't communicate.
Can't communicate. Oof. I mean, I think it's funny. I mean, I know I'm a writer, but I do feel like pretty much that's probably generally true how I feel most of the time, is that I can't communicate. That might be why I'm a writer. Like I get shy about speaking. I actually, I know you don't believe me because I'm standing right here, but I'm a total introvert. Like I'll go home tonight and I'll be like, oh, that was hard. But I like people, and I like trying to communicate, and so I guess writing. That's the story that you mentioned in here about my grandmother lost her voice. She had a baby. She had moved to a small town to go be with her husband, and she'd had a baby, and her milk didn't come in, and the local women said to her, don't give him cow's milk, he'll turn into a beast. And she listened to them, and he starved to death. And when she kind of realized how she had lived under the influence of these women, she couldn't forgive herself, and she had 4 more children. And my grandmother said, though, she could never speak above a whisper. And she was actually the inspiration for Ruth in Mr. Splitfoot, because I never met that woman. My dad lived with her, his grandma, but she was too old for me to meet. That story, that haunted me my whole life. Yeah. I mean, and that idea of like the things that haunt us, that was the impetus for the whole book. Like after Splitfoot, I kind of had this large collection of things that haunt me that didn't make it into that book. And I wanted to find a place for all those things. I mean, and I don't mean haunting necessarily like, ooh, scaring you at all, but the way that I think about haunting is almost like, this is kind of a gross metaphor, but like your heart getting plaque on it or something, like things that are hardened in your body that you can't get rid of, even if you might want to, or maybe you don't want to. Like there's the essay about One Direction in here, the boy band One Direction. Like that's not a haunting I want to get rid of. I mean, I just love them. No shame there at all. I just say it loud and proud. But still, that's a haunting. It's like pop music, the worm of pop music that gets into your ear. There's an essay on hormones, even just like trying to be like, I don't know. I mean, it just started, my daughter's like, how'd you get milk to come out of your boobs? And I was like, idea. No idea. And I was like, how can I not know how my own body works? This is crazy, you know. Anyway, all those different ideas of haunting, but that one about my great-grandmother was a huge one, that the voiceless woman, that whole idea has always haunted me. Yeah, Linda Thompson. I still didn't answer your question as you're, yeah, I'm doing a good job communicating though, right? No, maybe not. Okay, here's what I will say about that, about the question about communication. And it goes back to that thing that I said earlier about the Rings of Saturn. One thing I will do when I feel that I can't communicate is like I take a little bit, and then I take another little bit, and another little bit, and I'll collect them. And I'll just see how those things are in relation. I mean, probably some of you guys are trying to write a book right now, and I'll tell you, the way that I wrote my first book, The Seas, was I just wrote like 250 little short bits. And then I spread them out, and I was just like a bricklayer. I was like, how do these go together? How do these go together? But I think that that structure of like the separateness really helps me to communicate, because I can think about things in relation. Part of the problem with me for communication is the idea of the linearity. It's like, I don't like that narrative of the end. I don't like that. I want to stay here forever. I mean, part of like the reason for writing this book was to find another story for death, one that didn't hurt me as much. I got very tired of being hurt by death, and I was like, I need a new story. I mean, and a lot of that came out of like Darcy Steinke in her latest book about menopause. Such a beautiful book, those of you guys who haven't read it. Even people who will not go through menopause will love this book, I swear to you. It's an amazing book. But she quotes Katha Pollitt in there and says, like, storylessness has always been women's problem. And when I read that quote, I was like, whoa, okay, that's huge. That made so much sense to me. And I was like, that idea, though, about storylessness, about death, I'm like, why do we believe such sadness? Why do we believe that? Why do we believe the bad stories about death? I couldn't stand being hurt anymore by it. I just was like, I mean, that's a fool's mission. I realize I'm not going to not be sad when I lose somebody. But the thing that I realized that I hated was that I didn't like the idea that we had to leave this planet, like some Christian idea of a heaven that was removed. And when I was like, oh wait, you know, first law of thermodynamics, no matter is created or destroyed, nobody's going anywhere, everything is forever, I was like, okay, we're not going to go. We're all here together, and that helped me. And that also brought back that notion of the Rings of Saturn a little bit, you know, that will dissolve into rocks. And I think coming out of, I studied geology as an undergrad, and coming out of that, like the idea of going back to rocks, I was like, okay, I can do that. That was a long answer, sorry. Yeah, hey.
I've read that you compare the writing process to channeling, and I'm wondering if you could talk about the ways that the artists you admire haunt the Unwritten Book.
Haunt this book, haunt every book. Well, I mean, it's probably like dangerously close to plagiarism, is like, I'll ingest a book, and especially like the books that I read as a girl, I'll ingest them and maybe forget that they're even in me. Like, I mean, I do think that that's, well, here's the thing I'll say about that. It always kind of annoys me. I mean, I know this is a book of nonfiction, but primarily I write fiction, and I'm married to a journalist. And so there's like tension between the fiction and the nonfiction in my household, as you can imagine. And I'm always like telling the girls, I'm like, you know, fiction's the real story. It's like where we're actually, you know. I hear him on the phone like negotiating truth, and I'm like, I was like, I never do a negotiation like that. I'm straight up just humiliating myself all the time. And so that idea of like taking the fact that fiction and imagination makes things material, like thinking about Hedy Lamarr, the inventor, just from that chapter, like imagining things makes them real. So what's our problem with fiction, right? There should be no problem. There should be no suspicion of that. And so, sorry, Kate, but back to that idea of like ingesting other authors. So sometimes that will strike me where well, one example that I use in this book is like, I had read Bluest Eye in college, and I read it like, I mean, like a thirsty woman, you know, going for I couldn't believe it existed, and I was just like, wow, this is amazing. And then I didn't read it for 25 years, and then I wanted to teach it at Pratt. I was teaching a course on just blueness, and I wanted to teach it, and I read it again, and I had this experience of being like, oh my God, I've been like, I had her inside of me all these years, or I had that text inside of me, and probably like it came out and I thought it was mine, you know, like, I mean, and that's how influence works. I mean, like, you're inspired by people. In some ways, this book is like a way to recognize those people who I do feel made me, you know. I remember giving an interview with another writer, and we were all like asked who our influences were, and she said, I'm only influenced by how bad everything else is. And I was like, what? Who are you? What? I don't know. That happened like 25 years ago, you guys, and I still remember because I cannot figure out how somebody could feel that way. Anyways, this was like a place to be like, here's all the rocks that made me, you know. And it was an interesting accounting. And even this is not all the rocks that made me at all. That's another long answer, sorry. Anybody else have a question? Thank you guys so much. It's so nice to see all of you.
Thank you.